condition we are in the state of ignorance we are in the state of war, in the state of economic depression, in the state of depletion of the resources of our planet because of the greed of psychopaths who thought they could create their own reality. Well, look at the reality they created.
You're listening to The Truth Perspective on the Sott Radio Network, the world for people who think.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Truth Perspective. It is December 11th, and in the studio today, we have Jason Martin. Say hi, Jason.
Hello.
And we are very pleased to have back, it's been a while, Laura Knight-Yadchik. Welcome, Laura.
Hi, everybody.
And today, we are going to be interviewing Russell Gmirkin. Russell is an independent researcher and Bible scholar and has written two of what I consider, and probably most people that read them consider, some of the most revolutionary books in biblical studies. The first was published in 2006, titled, and I'm going to pronounce one of these names wrong, Berossus and Genesis, Manetho and Exodus, Hellenistic Histories and the Date of the Pentateuch. And this year, 2016, he released a follow-up to that book called Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible. And so we're going to be discussing Russell's work and just why and how revolutionary this stuff is. So, Russell, we're very happy to have you. Welcome to the show.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. It's very exciting.
And if you check out the description on the show, you can see a link to both of the books and to Russell's website, russellgmirkin.com. Russell, to start out with, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into this field, and maybe just some of the steps that led you to come to some of the conclusions that you include in these two books.
Sure. I have a very strong biblical background because I grew up in America, and like everyone else, I, went to church, read the Bible, went to a Bible college. And then I kind of went out of that and went into classical studies and got a lot of background in all the Greek histories and ancient sources. And then I got drawn back into biblical studies when I was doing some research for a book that I was writing called In Search of the Pillars of Hercules. And there was one source on the Pillars of Hercules named Berossus. He was a Babylonian priest. He wrote around 280 BC. And so anyway, I read his materials on this one research project, and I was just struck by how close his book on Babylonia resembled the early parts of Genesis. Scholars have for a long time understood that Genesis drew on all sorts of Mesopotamian sources. They know that it drew on the Babylonian creation story, the Sumerian king list with its 10 generations of incredibly long-lived kings before the flood, the Babylonian flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and others. Well, as it turns out, Berossus, he translated every one of those works, these exotic sources in ancient cuneiform and dead languages like Sumerian. He translated them all into Greek around 280 BC, so that the authors of Genesis only had to read Berossus to get all those Mesopotamian sources. And in fact, his translations and paraphrases were often closer to the biblical versions than the cuneiform originals. Mm-hmm. So to me, this showed that the authors of Genesis, they had to write sometime after 280 BC, and they had access to Greek books on history, including Berossus.
Well, and this is where we get into one of the big issues, because the common view of the Old Testament is that it was written thousands of years even before that. Is that correct? Like, can you tell us a bit about what the commonly held view is on the history of the Bible and when it was written?
You bet. The Bible claims to be an ancient book, and until the last few centuries, its claims were taken as at face value. Moses wrote the books of Moses, and Joshua wrote Joshua, Isaiah wrote Isaiah, and so forth. People still believe this. That's okay. I did it as a teenager. We all did, didn't we?
Yep.
But by around 1600, the top Bible scholars came to the realization that Moses just plain couldn't have written the books of Moses, which are, Genesis through Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible. Moses couldn't have written that anachronistic passage in Genesis that mentions later kings in Israel that were long after his time. He couldn't have talked about his own death in the book of Deuteronomy. And let's face it, Moses couldn't have written these books 500 years before the invention of the Hebrew alphabet. But still, if these books weren't quite as ancient as they claim to be, virtually all scholars, as late as 1990, still tried to date the books of Moses and the rest of the Bible just as early as possible, taking into account obvious anachronisms. And they imagined that these books were written in the time of Solomon or King Josiah or Ezra, certainly long before the coming of the Greeks. Then, in 1993, a Danish scholar named Niels Peter Lemke wrote a modest article called "Is the Old Testament a Hellenistic Book?" that asked the simple question: why do we insist on dating these biblical texts as early as possible? Why not look at the latest possible date as the proper starting point? Now, the first real evidence for the Old Testament comes from around 270 BC, when the 5 books of Moses were translated into Greek for the Great Library of Alexandria in Egypt, about 50 years after the conquests of Alexander the Great. Now, before that time, there are very few historical references to the Jews and no references to biblical writings. But after that date, there's an explosion of Bible-related writings. So what's the real evidence for the Bible being older than the 200s BC, other than naked assumption? Well, anyway, Niels Peter Lemke and Thomas Thompson and Philip Davies, they got into so much trouble in the 1990s in what came to be known as the minimalist-maximalist debate for even suggesting that the Bible might be as late as the Hellenistic era after the conquests of Alexander, when the Greeks ruled in the lands of the Near East. But now their view is pretty much mainstream, especially in Europe, although not all scholars in North America have gotten the memo. So, in 2 books, including Berossus and Genesis, and speeches at conferences and several articles, I've really provided the smoking gun evidence that the Bible really was written in the Hellenistic era, like they suggested, and that the team of Jewish scholars known to have translated the books of Moses from Hebrew to Greek for the Great Library at Alexandria around 270 BC, they also wrote the books of Moses using Greek sources they found at that library. So we now know for the first time in biblical scholarship who actually wrote the first books of Moses, when and where they were written, and what the favorite books were on their bookshelves. And it's almost like having a telescope into the past at the time the Bible was created, because we know the sources they read, we know a lot of their thinking, and we know how they went about writing these books. So it's a very exciting time for biblical scholarship, and I'm kind of proud for my contribution to the whole debate. So the Bible contains so many Greek parallels. It's now perfectly obvious that the biblical authors were very familiar with Greek literature, and that this could only have happened after the time of Alexander the Great, when the Greeks conquered the East from Egypt all the way to India, and including Judea, and they spread Greek culture in all those lands. So let me just point out one fun example, which I discuss in my latest book, Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible, of Greek parallel to the biblical material. The whole plot of Genesis, from Genesis through Joshua, I should say, it comes right out of a typical Greek foundation story, of which we have dozens of examples. In these stories, the land is typically promised by the gods to some famous ancestor, kind of like the Bible and Abraham. Later, an armed expedition sets out under a divinely chosen leader and lawgiver, like Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. And then this colonizing expedition reaches the Promised Land after many difficulties and adventures. The leader writes out the Constitution and the laws of the nation, and the land is conquered and divided up among the colonists, and etc., just like in the Bible. The Bible clearly got this whole storyline from the Greeks. And you could cite many other examples, with Greek parallels to biblical law collections and history writing and the prophets and the erotic poetry in the Song of Songs and the Greek play that is the Book of Job, and so on and so forth. So in the last 20 years, our knowledge has really kind of become revolutionized, and we're now really recognizing the Greek contributions to the Bible.
Russell, just one technical issue just before we get into it. Can you move your microphone a bit further away? We've got some feedback saying that we can kind of hear the noises. Okay, that sounds better. This? Yeah, that sounds better. Thanks.
Oh, good. Very good.
Laura, were you going to say something?
Yes, I was just going to say that, that this is, it is revolutionary, but, years and years ago when I was reading John Van Ceder's In Search of History, his In Search of Abraham, whatever, several books, he mentioned in there as an aside the problem of the relationship of the stories of the Old Testament to Greek stories, and also to the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I had I'd always thought that this story of David and Goliath was just so bizarre, because here's David against this giant, and he's got the stones in his pouch. And he cuts the giant's head off, this overwhelming power. And it just struck me that this little pericope of the David cycle just was so much like the story of Perseus and Medusa. You've got the stones, she turned you to stone if you looked at her. He's got the stones in the pouch. He cuts her head off, puts it in a pouch. David's got a pouch, cuts the head off of Goliath, and so forth. The small guy against the big overwhelming force. And I just, it stuck with me for years and years. So I was really happy when I read that.
Yeah,
well,
that's.
Go ahead.
That's a very interesting parallel. There's a lot of parallels between David and Goliath and Homer's Iliad too. They had a lot of stories where one champion from one army would face off against the other champion from the other army, and one battle witnessed by both sides. And Goliath, he's dressed up like a typical Greek soldier. He even has a little shield carrier like the Greek hoplites. And it's just very Greek. It's there's the Perseus and Medusa echoes. There's lots of Greek echoes in especially in the stories of David. There comes a lot comes out of Homer. Quite a number of parallels. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, so then you go along and you read things like Bruce Loudon and his comparison of some of the Old Testament stories to the Odyssey, and then Wesalius, who compares the overarching structure of the Old Testament from Genesis through 2 Kings as being very similar to the structure of Herodotus' histories, and then what's his name, Wagenbaum, who wrote the Argonauts of the Desert and made all those comparisons. And somewhere in there, your book came in, because I was reading them fairly chronologically, and it was just like it all began to make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, well, Philippe's book played a large role in my current book, Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible. Right after I wrote my first book on Berossus and Genesis, I started on a second book on Greek sources on the whole Bible. Well, I had it really completed in 2011, and my editor, Thomas Thompson, said, I should take a look at this new book by this young Belgian scholar named Philippe Wadenboom, Argonauts of the Desert, and maybe incorporate some of his stuff on Plato into my book. So his book was basically a catalog of all possible little literary parallels between biblical and Greek writings, including Plato's Laws, which had, it has extensive legal parallels to the Mosaic Laws, as was known since Greek and Roman times. The church father Eusebius, he had a large section with comparisons between the Bible and Plato's Laws. So when I read Philippe's book, I basically tossed out my manuscript and started over. And I decided to embark on a systematic comparison of biblical, Greek, and ancient Near Eastern laws to see where the biblical laws came from, and if they came from Plato's Laws, like Philippe had suggested. I really dreaded researching the biblical law collections, which I considered to be the most boring part of the Bible, except for maybe those genealogies and chronicles.
Yep.
But I had
That's horrible.
It's tough. It's really tough reading. So I had to research every biblical law and every law in all the law collections of the ancient Near East, like Hammurabi's Law Code, and every Greek law on inscriptions and literary collections and everywhere, including the theoretical laws proposed in Plato's Laws, which was the last book that he wrote around 350 BC. Now, no one had ever done this before. No one had compared Greek, ancient Near Eastern, and biblical laws before. Why was that? It's because everyone had assumed that the Bible's laws were super ancient, certainly older than Plato. So why bother? It would have been a pointless exercise in the opinion of scholars clear down till, the 1990s. So when I did this huge research project, what I discovered was pretty stunning. The Bible has a huge debt to Greek laws, and especially to Plato's laws, along with just a handful of laws that do come from the Mesopotamian ancient Near Eastern law collections, but mostly from the Greeks. And it's just evident that the biblical authors at Alexandria's library had done extensive comparative international legal research there, which was very common for Greek legislators who were putting together a law code before they wrote down the biblical laws of Moses. So The laws of Moses are based on a lot of these laws from Greek sources, and as it turned out, Plato's Laws was the most important book that they consulted. You can find traces of it from the first chapter of Genesis right through the prophets, and in fact, the very idea of a Bible, a national collection of approved sacred texts, it comes right out of Plato's Laws.
Russell, can you...
It's absolutely fascinating that all these years we've been conditioned to think that the Old Testament and Judaism is like, what do they call it, sui generis, and Christianity, of course, is the unparalleled fulfillment of Judaism, and of course they have to keep Judaism in that pure state, from God's mouth to Moses' ear, and then immediately take that and bridge over into Christianity, so that they preserve this this power structure is what it amounts to. It's a power structure. It's about our God is the right God, and biblical studies are done in such a way that it preserves this forever. Is there television in the background somewhere?
No, we're getting some echo.
Me too, a little bit.
That's their voice coming through on a speaker or earphones that are leaking.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that's the way I felt about it. Was just absolutely stunned.
I do have a question.
Yes.
What is the issue that the people who seem to be kind of very much against this investigation into the Old Testament? There's obviously a group of scholars who are really identified with the idea of the sui generis Judaism. What is it precisely that they fear in this kind of investigations?
Well, there's a couple answers to that. One of them is that most biblical scholarship is done in, or a lot of it's done in seminaries and religious studies programs and things like that in the U.S. So there's a conflict of interest. It's kind of the fox in charge of the hen house, sort of a thing. But the other thing is I think it's largely scholarly inertia. Thomas Kuhn's book, the Structure of Scientific Revolution, he talks about the inertia of paradigms, how knowledge is passed down from teachers to students, and the students adopt all of the assumptions of their revered teachers that they studied at the feet of, and then they perpetuate it right down the line. And it's very hard to talk about a really challenging new perspective. It's revolutionary because you have to throw out your education. You have to throw out all the books you've ever written. So it almost takes, a lot of times it takes someone from the outside who goes into a field without any of the assumptions and without being indebted to, the person who proposed them, ran their PhD program, to go in with a fresh set of, or rather a lack of assumptions, a new perspective, and kind of reinvent a field from the ground up. Now, when the Copenhagen School, Niels Peter Lemke and Thomas Thompson and Philip Davies, all of whom I got to meet at a recent conference in Copenhagen, by the way, they're great people. When they challenged the maximalist assumption that all these books were way far ancient, and said, well, let's look at the whole range of possibility. They could have been written any time between, say, the time of Moses and 270 BC. let's look at that whole range of dates as possible and see where they fall in there. Well, that throwing out the assumptions of the antiquity of the Bible, it just opens new possibilities in research, and that's how I came in, and I looked at any Greek sources or ancient Near Eastern sources before, say, 270 BC, and I looked at them as all potential sources for the Bible, and discovered, yes, the Bible drew on Berossus and on the Egyptian priest Manetho and Plutarchus and Plato in this case. Yeah. But if you share those old assumptions, and especially if you're paid to have those assumptions, you're just not going to go down that road. And surprisingly, I've had little really negative feedback from other scholars. Scholars have been pretty receptive to my work, except when they're protecting their own books that they've published. I don't think Van Cedars likes me very much.
Oh dear.
He really initiated this whole comparison between Greek writings on history and biblical writings, but he dates the biblical writings way early, way before the Greeks ever came into Judea and the East. And so I don't understand how he can believe that all of this influence took place before the Greeks and the Jews had any context,
Yeah. It's kind of strange because...
Well, for me, I mean, this made Old Testament studies far more interesting instead of... I kind of like the idea of the Old Testament being rooted in Hellenistic culture more than being sort of this... off from this sort of Middle Eastern small kind of backwoods, province. It kind of seemed very alien to me, but I think this actually makes it all the more interesting and more exciting to say, oh, wait a minute, there's this huge historical cultural influence coming through. I mean, it's like a line that connects all the way back into the past instead of being this line that connected to this one place that stopped in this sort of foreign land. It's like, oh, there's influences from various other countries in Asia Minor. There's Babylonia. There's, all these different areas, but there's also sort of the Hellenistic Greeks. And for me, that makes everything far more interesting when you read the biblical stories now. When I look at them, I start looking at them through that lens, and they seem so much more interesting, so much more connected to history than they ever did before.
Yeah, before it was, from God's mouth to Moses' ear, and that was it. And you're not allowed to question that. What was God doing before he created the world? He was creating hell for people who ask questions.
Something else that's interesting is there was kind of an echo phenomenon where, the Greeks invented a lot of historiography. Van Cedars and Halpern, they said, well, the Jews actually invented historiography before the Greeks. And Halpern has said, well, the Jews invented a demythologized cosmology in Genesis 1 when the Greeks were doing the same thing. And Westberg said, well, the Jews and Greeks, they were coming up with parallel laws at the same time. You had all these echoes, and there must be 10 different areas where the Jews either had a primacy of discovery independent of the Greeks or parallel and independent based on the biblical writings. I'm not doing anything just to subtract from the genius of the Jews. But all these different echoes, nobody ever tied it all together and said, hey, maybe these Jewish writings came after the Greeks, and all these things that we've credited the ancient Jews and Israelites for, they learned it from the Greeks. That's a very economical explanation as to why they're so very similar.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the... That's one of the impressions. Go ahead, Laura.
I was just going to say there's another area that strikes me as furiously interesting, and that's the whole idea of monotheism. Because I recently read, well, not so recently, but some time ago, I read Norman Kahn's book on apocalypticism, and he he finds that it really kind of originated with the Zoroastrians. And then you start digging into Zoroaster and, his whole monotheistic shtick. And you get into the Mary Boyce, who thinks that Zoroaster was, far, far earlier. And you realize that there were some connections between the Mitannian Empire and the Egyptian Empire just prior to the appearance of Akhenaten and his monotheistic thing. And you start wondering, where this came from, because when you read studies of the archaeology of the Palestinian area, you realize that they were basically polytheistic, and they were, a lot of them were engaged in child sacrifice and so forth. And there are echoes of that in the prophetic writings, Ezekiel and Isaiah and so forth, condemning the the Jews or the proto-Jews or the Canaanites, whatever, for their child sacrifice and the sin of Manasseh, et cetera, et cetera. And you get the idea that they didn't really become monotheists until after their exposure to the Persian Empire. So they picked up some things from Persia, from Babylon, from Egypt, etc., and then a whole lot of stuff, put it all together during the time of the Greeks, and kind of came up with a big pot of soup, so to speak. And, I've been finding that to be extremely interesting. It's as though, but then what they did was they wrote it in such a way with the claim to, the original everything. And, as Bruce Loudon points out, some of the stories, they turn things around completely so that it seems like the story is not the same as the Greek story that it's derived from. For example, Abraham arguing with God about the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, similar to the goddess arguing with Zeus about the fate of Odysseus and his men. So it's, so instead of the goddess arguing with the god about the fate of a man, you have a man arguing with God about the fate of other people. So it's like everything is disguised very cleverly, and the claim to total originality is put out there, and people believed it because when Christianity came along, it needed Judaism to be, the direct line to God, the God of the universe, the creator.
Well, if I remember correctly, didn't Aphrodite argue? Sorry. Oh, you go ahead, Russell.
Well, I was just going to reinforce some of what Laura said. We know from ancient inscriptions that they found that the Jews and the Samaritans, they were polytheists. The inscriptions say that Yahweh had a consort or wife named Asherah, who, the Bible condemns the Asherah up one side and down the other, but that's what they had back then. Yahweh had a wife. And we know from the Elephantine papyri of around 450 to 400 BC, Elephantine was a Jewish and Aramean Samaritan military colony on the Nile, above the Nile. It kind of protected Egypt from invasion from the Ethiopians. So this military colony, they found a bunch of papyri still preserved in Egypt's hot climate from around 450 to 400 BC. And in those, we learned that Jews had a temple in Jerusalem. The Jews at Elephantine, they had a temple of Yahweh there at Elephantine. We know the Samaritans had a temple of Yahweh at Gerizim. They had all sorts of temples, and the people at Elephantine, they swore by Yahweh and Beth Anath and, a few other Aramean and Babylonian gods. They were polytheists. Around 415 BC, they wrote the religious authorities in Jerusalem and Samaria saying, the Egyptians just tore down our temple. Can we have another one? Can we have a new one? And the people in Jerusalem said, sure. So, for a fact that the Bible hadn't been written
at that time.
At that time, they didn't have monotheism. They didn't have one temple. They didn't have the Sabbath. You have the 7 days of the week, a 7-day week at Elephantine, but you have this one business owner who threatens to kill one of his employees unless he shows up on the seventh day and takes a boatload of vegetables. They were working on Saturday. So, the Bible's later than that. And monotheism is later than that too. I tend to view monotheism, though, as in the Bible, as mostly coming out of Plato. It's quite a few people have suggested Zoroaster and the Persians, but part of the reason for that is because they believe that the Bible was written in the Persian era and no later. But if you also consider possible Greek influence, Plato was a monotheist. Several of the Greek philosophers were monotheists. Anaxagoras, he was prosecuted for atheism because he believed in one God. And so was Aristotle, and Socrates was executed for that reason. And so Plato did a really interesting thing. It's really interesting because it has biblical parallels. He said, all right, my teacher Socrates, he had to drink hemlock because Athens considered him an atheist because he believed in this weird one God sort of a thing, and a few other reasons. So Plato said, we're going to have that one philosopher's God. His name was nous, which means intelligence or mind or reason. We're going to have him. He's kind of the god of the ruling class and the philosophers and the people who are going to run this state that I'm inventing. But the regular people underneath, they can have as many gods as they want. They can have all 12 gods of the Olympian deities that Athens had. In fact, we'll make it a law that if you don't believe in the 12 gods, you'll be executed just like they, as an atheist, just like they did in Athens. So he had his own private monotheism that for him and his guys, his clique, his ruling class elites. And then the popular people, they were allowed to have all sorts of gods. And you see the same thing in the Bible. Genesis 1 basically has one God, and a lot of that stuff comes out of Plato's book, the Timaeus, which talked about how the universe came into existence. But Genesis 2 jumps into, multiple gods and this local god Yahweh who's walking around in the Garden of Eden. And the book of Psalms and Deuteronomy, they talk about El and his 70 sons, his divine council. They had all sorts of gods that they recognized. They just said that Yahweh was the Jewish God or the best God. So they had this kind of monotheism that coexisted with polytheism. And the Bible really isn't monotheistic except Genesis 1 and maybe a couple chapters in Isaiah. Later generations of Jews who read the Bible, they came around to the idea of only one God. But the idea of multiple gods named El and Yahweh and things like that, that hung around for a remarkably long time.
Well,
So
Russell,
it's all.
Go
ahead, Harrison.
Yeah, getting into because you mentioned, well, Laura mentioned the Persian influence, and then you mentioned that this, in your mind, looks more like an influence straight from Plato. This kind of gets into the issue of looking at the Bible, as a book written in 270 BC, because the Bible covers a history that stretches back thousands of years, and all the famous Bible stories. So the slavery in Egypt and the Exodus, and then coming back, and then the exile, and in Babylonia, and and then the Persian influence. So you've got all these stories and all this kind of history mishmashed in there, and in your book you point out, the one thing that stands out for me is that a lot of the earliest stories seem like they are just almost like complete fabrications based on these histories and stories that you find in the Greek writings. But I'm wondering if you could tell us what you think about the history pre-270 BC in the Bible. How much of that do you think might actually be true, or is it all this kind of fan fiction or historical fiction that you find in like the stories of Moses, for example? Like, what about the Persian influence and the prophets writing in exile and things like that?
Well, I think the starting point for the modern discussion has to be that the Bible was put together in the 270s BC. But Plato also advocated that, when you're creating this national literature, which we can get into his invention of the Bible in a little while later. But he said that you should research all the old local legends and the local gods and ancient temples, and incorporate as much of that into your national literature and your cultural traditions as possible, so that all this stuff appears to be ancient and based in the gods of the land and all of that. So there was an impetus to preserve as many ancient materials as were compatible with the new laws that were created in 270 BC, and to preserve parts of Jewish heritage that were considered harmless or supporting the new system of government that they were inventing. So we know some of the sources were ancient. I mean, the king lists in especially for the northern kingdom. I don't know, starting after Ahaz or so. Ahab, and in Judea, starting with around Hezekiah. A lot of that stuff is very accurate. The chronology is accurate. The names are accurate. We know that because these kings were mentioned in Assyrian inscriptions, and the chronology lines up. So the Book of Kings has these chronicles of the kings of Israel and of Judah, and those have to preserve, king lists from the monarchy. So that part's accurate. Once you get earlier than that, the divided monarchy where Israel and Judah are separate, once you get in the time of David and before that, that's legend or novelistic, or it's the biblical authors didn't even cite any sources for that older material. Mm-hmm. And the David stories are clearly novelistic, and they have lots of parallels with Homer and with other Greek writings. And the Moses story, the Exodus, they had, that was really basically pretty much made up based on an earlier account by a man named Hecataeus of Abdera. He was a Greek writer. He went to Egypt, and he wrote a book on Egypt for the first king in Egypt after Alexander the Great. And in this book, he had a little story about the foundations of Judea. He said that someone named Moses went to led out a colonizing expedition from Egypt because the Egyptians were overpopulated, and they went to Judea, which was uninhabited at the time, and he came up with 12 tribes and all sorts of laws and wrote a constitution and founded a temple and did all these things. And he basically founded Jerusalem and its temple, according to this really typical Greek foundation story written around 315 BC. Well, the Greeks, King Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, who ruled Egypt, he read this book by Hecataeus of Abdera, and he and his people, they were very curious about this story about how this Egyptian named Moses wrote these laws of the Jews. So they sent a request to the Jews saying, we want to know about these laws that we found in this foundation story from Hecataeus. And that's when the Jews sent this delegation of scholars to Alexandria to provide a copy of their laws for the Great Library of Alexandria. And also, since these were the ancestral laws, they also had to have the story of how these laws came into existence. And they basically took their cue from this earlier Greek story from Hecataeus. So we actually know the source of that. It's a Greek story. Hecataeus didn't know anything about the Bible. The Bible hadn't been written yet. He just wrote this kind of a fantastic story of the Egyptians founding Judea, kind of like he said the Egyptians founded Babylon, and they founded Athens, and they founded other colonies all around the world. And he had stories for them too. Well, so the story of Moses is based on this Greek story that from like 40 or 50 years earlier. It basically takes the plot out of that. And so you can kind of divide up the history in the Jewish Bible, and it splits into kind of three parts. There's the earliest parts are like pure mythology, and then later on you get into stuff that might be kind of legendary. There might be some legends about Abraham or Isaac associated with some altar in Samaria. They could have had oral traditions for some of this stuff. And then finally you get to material that has some historic content, like the Book of Kings. And then in the prophets are mostly very late, but there's some early materials in them as well. We know that they're late because for one thing, most of the prophets refer to writings from the Book of Moses. And so they have to come after 270 BC. Another really interesting thing is that the prophets, several of them talk about how this Jewish sacrificial system was kind of useless, that all these sacrifices and prayers were a waste of time, and the important thing was righteousness, and that God couldn't be bribed with all this endless stream of sacrifices. Well, that comes right out of Plato. He talks about these same things in several of his books, The Republic and Laws and some others. It's all straight out of Plato, so it has to be late. Mm-hmm. There's also some early stuff too. The Book of Haggai appears to be an authentic collection of oracles from around 515 BC, around the time when the Jews were finally given authorization to construct their temple. And There's another really I love finding older materials in the Bible and the prophets and things like that. It's fascinating. Most of it is old and is late in Greek, but there's some interesting early stuff. For instance, the first chapter of Ezekiel has this vision of God's throne as a chariot on this heavenly realm that has jewels sparkling in the floor, and there's the cherubim and the seraphim and all the eyes and this and that. There's only about 2 or 3 lines in there that even mention Yahweh, and most of it reads exactly like a Babylonian source that talks about Marduk's throne up in the skies. Mm-hmm. And so here you have in Ezekiel, you have this Babylonian document that has a couple of glosses that mention Yahweh, so it's kind of domesticated and turned into a Jewish thing, but it's pure Babylonian. So there are spots in the Bible that do preserve old traditions, and it's really interesting to investigate and find where they are. But the old assumption that it's all ancient it's pretty much out the window at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the direction that biblical studies needs to go about now, is to start looking for the really old texts and trying to divide things and look at it from a reasonable point of view. What else can they do? I mean, once you know it's not as old as you think it is, start working with what you have.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's like an archaeological site. You see this site, and it contains some old artifacts. So you say, well, this is from, the time of David or Solomon or whatever. And the archaeologists, they used to like bulldoze the top layers that weren't interesting, the late stuff. They said, this isn't interesting. We like the Bible stuff. But then you discover, hey, we dated this whole thing wrong. It's from, the period of kings clear into the Hellenistic era, and we need to find all the different strata, all the layers, all the different datable layers of materials to come up with a whole history. Well, looking at the Bible is the same way. There's old stuff in it. And that stuff's really interesting, but the late stuff is really fascinating too.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I think the late. Go ahead.
You meant, or Russell, were you going to say something?
Nope. I was going to sit back and let you guys say something interesting.
Well, this leads into something I want to actually get back to, something we were talking about, because I think Jason had asked the question of, why do people have such resistance to this kind of research? And I think one of the parts to the answer of that question gets back to the original goal of why the Bible was written in the way that it was, and how Plato had basically set out how to carry out this entire project, because he essentially wrote that into his plan, how to create a system, how to create this national library, and how to create a society that completely believes in the truth of this founding document, of these laws, and to do it in such a way that everyone fervently believes it, and so that it will last for years and years and years. And so, if anything, I think that the very fact that we have Christianity today and Judaism still going on is a testament to just how effective Plato's method was. So I was wondering if we could now get into Plato and what exactly he envisioned, what he the plan that he had, and how it was put into action by these Jewish scholars in Alexandria.
Sure, you bet. He had this genius plan that he laid out on how to take a brand new colony in a new location and create a new government for a new nation, and the citizens that they brought in would have total obedience and be so loyal to that nation that it would last forever. He gave a lot of forethought to this problem. And for him, the key to it all was to have a set of laws from God or the gods given in ancient times, that the laws of the nation were supposed to have a divine origin. Kind of like he was modeling them on this idea on the divine laws of the Spartans and Crete and a few other countries that their constitution had lasted for, like the Spartans had lasted for 400 years unchanged. That was a long time back then. And it was partly because of the respect given to the laws of Sparta, which were allegedly given to their founder by, I think it was Zeus in that case. So Plato said it doesn't matter if we're writing a whole new set of laws for this nation. We have to make the people believe they are ancient and they are divine. There's a very crucial passage that I have in front of me where he stated, if there exist laws under which men have been reared up and which, with heaven's blessing, have remained unaltered for many centuries, so that there exists no recollection or report of their ever having been different from what they are now, then the whole soul is forbidden by reverence and fear to alter any of the things established in ancient times. So by hook or by crook, by any device possible, then, our lawgiver must devise a means whereby this shall be true of his state. So if you're going to found a new nation, or if you're going to refound a new nation, as in the case of the Jews, you have to make the people believe, according to Plato, that their laws were divine, that they've been given centuries earlier, that they've never been changed, and then everyone will be reverent and fear to alter, a jot or a tittle, in the words of Jesus. So to make these brand new laws that Plato wrote in his book, Plato's Laws that he wrote, and then to have the audacity to claim that they were divine and exceedingly ancient, Plato had these strategies. For one thing, he claimed that he was inspired. He believed that as a philosopher and using reason, that his soul was in contact with the divine sphere. So, and that Plato's Laws, that book itself, was inspired, that God was guiding the conversation, and that it was all divine, because after all, he was writing it, right? So it was inspired. But he said, though, that basically to sell the people that their laws were ancient and divine, and to program their conscious as a nation. He was a social engineer. He was engineering people's thinking from one generation to the next. He said that one of his strategies was the rulers should investigate and incorporate all the local gods and deities, the old temples that they could find in the area, and old altars, ancient sacred laws and ancient festivals. Sure, why not? We'll incorporate those religious laws into our law code. Find out who the local priesthoods are and get their support. And, if there's an inherited line of priests, we'll give them a role in our new government, and we'll adopt the old legends. So all of this created an aura of antiquity and a connection to the land and a connection to the gods of the lands. And it really, it brought the priests into the whole organization so that they'd have an interest in saying that all of this stuff was ancient and divine. So that was a really incredibly sort of genius, if devious, strategy that he had. And but finally, additionally, I should say, he also laid out instructions for creating a national literature. This was really important to his overall strategy. The most important text in this literature was going to be the law book, which the Jews call the Torah. Besides this, the rulers were supposed to review all existing literature, everything they had on hand, and approve it or reject it, edit it, revise it for compatibility with these divine laws, with the law code. They were supposed to come up with a new set of authoritative hymns, kind of like the Psalms, and plays like the Book of Job, and prose and history, and all literature in this new state were going to require prior approval by these legislators of the arts, and only these texts were supposed to be used in the schools. All outside literature was forbidden. All cultural contact with the outside world were forbidden. So they were isolated. It's like the whole nation was kind of like, sort of like a cult in a way. The Spartans used this approach, and they were very effective in keeping their nation and its same constitution for a long time. They outlawed foreign contacts, and they had this educational system where all of their soldiers were trained from the year 6, age 6 on up. All of their education was by the state. Well, the Plato advocated a similar system. The Jews had a similar system with their national literature. And Plato said that if you use the schools to program the youth, he said the youth, they'll believe anything you teach them. If you get them young enough, they will accept anything you teach them. And if you use this approved canonical literature, and if that's where all your education comes from, Plato said it would only take a generation or two for the citizens to forget their actual history, which, in his metaphor, their memories would be wiped clean like a slate, like erasing a chalkboard. And they would come to believe that their laws and their way of life had been revealed to their distant ancestors by the gods. And so, and as a result, the people would be so loyal to these divine, unchanging laws and their sacred literature that the nation would last forever. And you see all these same things in the creation of the Hebrew Bible and in the Jewish theocracy, incorporating the local gods and the local temples and altars and the local priesthoods and some of the legends. And it was a very, very effective approach Plato had. So that was his strategy. He lays it all out in great detail. This is clearly what the Jewish people who wrote the books of Moses in around 270 BC, they were following this strategy. And it's fascinating because once you know the books that they were reading, you actually know their motivation as authors and as legislators, and what they were trying to accomplish. They were creating a theocracy, which is a new form of government that Plato invented, ruled not by a king but by God, through these divine laws, and through, he said that there should be, the rule should be by a panel of theologians and priests who were experts in the law and philosophy, very much like this new theocratic form of government that you see in the Hellenistic era in Judea, with rule by a high priest and by the Sanhedrin and by the council of priests. All of that comes right out of Plato. He basically invented the Jewish form of government as well as their literature. He had this great program, and you can see from beginning to end how the Jews implemented it. And they also,
it's kind of horrifying. It's horrifying to think that he came up with this social engineering project, and the only people who really took it seriously and effectively implemented it were this group of Jewish writers, rewriters, and it really has worked for 2,000 years.
Well, as long as you don't have a country, it worked pretty well. I mean, for 2,000 years, they didn't have a country, and his republic was a republic without a land,
That's absolutely true. And it's amazing that even when the Jewish temple fell in 135 BC, when Jews were not allowed in Jerusalem anymore after the Bar Kokhba revolt, and the Jewish nation really came to a complete screeching halt, an end, it still persisted for 2,000 years. You get this nation that's continuing with these foundation myths, and it persisted clear to the modern times, and now we have a Jewish nation again, and it's probably going to last forever. But the Jews were not really the only group. They were the first ones. The Greek and Roman writers, they said, "Yeah, Plato's laws. You're never going to make this work. That's crazy." His all of these ideas for creating a rule by God and laws as education and all these novel ideas. They're nuts. It'll never work. Well, the Jews implemented all of those, and they worked incredibly miraculous. And really, they're a people that were created by their national literature. I mean, not created. Well, their culture was more or less created or invented, or certainly solidified based on the literature. The Arabs, they called the Jews the people of the book. And because they were a people whose existence was centered on this, the Jewish Bible. And the Jews like that, by the way. They acknowledged, yes, we are the people of the book. But the Christians were another people of the book. They had their own book, the New Testament. And Islam is another people of the book, the Quran. So those people were imitating the Jewish Bible. So you go from Plato to the Jews to the Christians to Islam. And gosh darn it, it worked every time. So,
and look what we have now.
Yeah, I'll leave it to our listeners to decide whether it was a good thing or a bad thing.
Well,
exactly.
I hadn't thought about it while reading the book, but while having the discussion, it just as a quick aside, I was thinking about the parallels with Islamic State today, and because I've been reading a couple books, one about a German journalist who Jürgen Todenhofer, who went into the Islamic State in 2014 and talked to a lot of these guys and how they describe what they're doing and why they're doing it and how they're doing it. And it's pretty much the same thing. It's like these guys it sounds like they've read Plato or they've read the Bible and they've got the same idea. And so I think that's just one example of the extreme like negative, obviously negative ways that this can go about and the fruit that it can bear.
Yes.
Well, I mean, like go ahead, Russell, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that Plato's dark genius has cast its shadow down through history. And we will be feeling him for a long time from now. But, my book hopefully kind of pulls the curtain aside, curtain aside and you see Plato saying, "Ignore the man, behind the curtain." And maybe when people realize how this actually came about, then at least future generations of young people, maybe they'll have a chance not to be a choice, not to be indoctrinated or to have more than one view of how all of this could have come about. So I don't know. There's some hope. Maybe not for the next 4 years, but or the next century, but looking into the future.
We just need to use some of Plato's ideas to
No,
to get these ideas out there.
His ideas have spread even further than the sort of theocratic governance. I mean, secular ideologies are also based on Plato. I mean, Shafarevich kind of pointed that out about Marxism and Leninism, that it was sort of Plato's republic, the virtuous state. So there have been plenty of secular attempts to adopt Plato's ideology, and has led to not necessarily the best results.
That's absolutely true. Now, I have tried to find out whether Marx and Lenin and those guys had read Plato, because, Plato's Republic, of course, he
Marx,
proposed, he proposed communism. At least sharing of property and sharing of wives and things like that. But I haven't yet discovered whether or not they actually did read Plato. But the parallels are certainly astounding. And if you look at North Korea, you have not only the communism and the local mythology, but the cultural isolation, where North Korea believes what they believe because they can't get any information from the outside world, and that's that's a very Platonic strategy and very effective.
Well, the interesting thing is that those ideas, like the sharing of wives and communal property, I mean, there was a play by Aristophanes. What was it called? I can't remember the name of it, where in his play, all of the women in Greece kind of dress up with beards, and they go in and they vote to turn over the power to them, and then they basically institute, essentially, like the way it's described in the fragment that I read from the play, it is essentially like, Marxism. It's sort of communism with communal property and communal wives and everybody working together. And, they're old ideas, and they can be traced through all the way up through history, all the way up to Marx. So I'm pretty sure that Marx would have read certainly Plato's Republic.
I would think so. Aristotle had an interesting criticism of Plato's Republic. He said, with everybody having wives in common and all of that, you're gonna have people who are marrying their own sister. You
right.
have no way of knowing. He said that's just wrong, and so that was a bit of a criticism he had for his mentor Plato.
And it was a legitimate criticism, and I think that there are a number of legitimate criticisms about Plato, as much as he is held in such high esteem by many, many people.
Undeservedly.
Undeservedly, I think. This whole Republican laws is, almost, it's Machiavellian.
Well, it seemed to me that Aristotle was kind of trying to put forward, I suppose, maybe not really a counter argument necessarily, but a counter program in politics and Nicomachean ethics. And he kind of wrote very extensively on all those topics too. And it seemed like his version was different from Plato's, that he diverged and actually I think in the end he stopped liking Plato very much. I'm not sure about that though.
Well, he certainly had a different approach. Plato, in his early works, he really studied rhetoric and persuasion and myth and kind of all the tools of propaganda. I guess we can call
Right.
it that. And he condemned the sophists who were the masters of rhetoric and their techniques. He said you could convince anybody of anything with those techniques, but in his later works, he incorporated rhetoric right and left, and his basic approach was to use myth and story and rhetoric and persuasion to persuade ordinary people to obey the laws and be virtuous, even if they didn't really understand it all. And then the philosophers, they were going to be in charge. They would have knowledge. Everyone else would have opinions, but
Right.
reason and knowledge weren't for the common people. The rulers had to shape their beliefs and behaviors. But Aristotle, he said, well, in his book on rhetoric, he basically said, everybody can understand reason, and reason is accessible to everybody, and you can't just use rhetorical arguments to manipulate people into what you believe. I'm more of an Aristotelian myself than a Plato guy, but I really understand Plato.
Well, I mean, I was sort of there's a few little things about Plato that I read or heard about. There was a sort of an incident where he supposedly purchased up all the books of Pythagoras or something like that, or some collection of books, and then buried them. And it seemed like he may have been the type that was going around and kind of suppressing what he considered to be, important knowledge and sort of filtering it through his own system, through his own academy. So he seems to be sort of like this really cultic individual. And I found that a little bit distasteful. I didn't really like the various different stories that you have of him.
Well, I don't know about that particular story, but in the Republic, he laid out a whole program for censorship. He says that all the poets should be banned, and the Greek poetry should be censored, either eliminated or edited. And you have the same thing in laws, where you had the Nocturnal Council, this council of priests and theologians. They were basically the thought police, and they controlled literature, they controlled speech, they controlled what plays you could put on, what jokes you could tell, what song. You'd have to, if you were a comedian, you had to run your material past the censors before you could tell it to people. So he was just heavily into mind control. Is that the way to phrase it?
Yeah.
Or at least programming beliefs and behaviors.
Well, yeah. I mean, he invented that. I guess, what did he call it? Psychogogy or something like that. This basically brainwashing children to believe something that he admittedly was false. Right? His whole project was kind of to tell people a series of very noble lies, and to basically brainwash them in those, to keep them subjugated to the state.
Yes, he said that, and this is interesting. He said that if you tell a story set in ancient times, when you really don't know what was going on anyway, nobody really knows, then you can tell a lie, a fiction, and it can be more true than the real truth if it conveys positive beliefs about the gods.
Right.
And that was basically his his approach to ancient history is you go back far enough and you can say whatever you want. In the Republic, he laid out his whole political theory first in the Republic. Later, he wrote two books called Timaeus and the Critias about the story of Atlantis. And in that, he had Critias said that he heard this tale that the Greek lawgiver Solon heard from the Egyptians about the ancient residents of of Athens, and how they defended the whole world against the wicked people from Atlantis. And he said that these ancient Athenians before the big flood wiped out all of the records of this stuff, that their government was exactly like in the Republic. He said, Solon, he said that they had the guardian class and the craftsmen and this and that. And Socrates was so amazed that was exactly what he had just laid out in the Republic the night before. So
how convenient.
How convenient. And he said, okay, so we're going to tell this myth, but we're going to tell it as though it's fact. It's passed from the realm of myth into the realm of fact. And since it was in ancient times, you could make up anything. It didn't matter if it was false. You could pass it off as true because it would support the national ideology and the Constitution and laws and the beliefs of the ruling class.
I mean, that kind of stuff is like a real slippery slope, though, if you look at it. Like, first you start saying, well, we're talking about the distant past, but when you start using the distant past to justify what you're doing today, then all of a sudden, well, it's not so much about, telling a lie about the past. It's telling a lie about the past to support a present propaganda. And of course, it was kind of convenient that the most holy book in his republic was going to be his own book, the Laws, that was going to be everything. And he was going to be the philosopher king. And I mean, it's like, well, yeah, it's kind of convenient that you come up with a political system that will ensure that you get to rule over everybody. I think we kind of know what type of person does that.
Exactly true.
So it seems like Plato ends up being, in a very real sense, the philosophical father of lies.
Pretty much. I mean, if you think about it, though, I mean, he is sort of very satanic, actually, from a Miltonian, John Milton sense.
That leads me to a question that I was curious about Plato, because I've read different accounts of this, and this is somewhat controversial, and that's his thoughts on pederasty and homosexuality. Because I believe there's one passage in the book where where Russell, you talk about this, and how some of the things that Plato had written on homosexuality made it into the Bible. But then I've also heard that at least in one interpretation, he is very pro pederasty in some of his other works. Do you have any more information on that and what he thought about that?
Well, yeah, I can give you an overview. It's nothing that I'm particularly innovative about. I'll just report what's common knowledge. Well, first off, of course, in Sparta, ancient Sparta, which was a military state, the soldiers in Sparta, they were pretty much expected to have a junior soldier that they would train and rear up and also have sexual relations with. And the loyalty between the young soldier and the old soldier made them defend each other in battle. And it was supposed to be a good thing from a military standpoint. And Plato was a big fan of the Spartan system. And in the Republic, he said that if you were one of these guardians, the warriors class, who were supposed to be as ferocious as a pit bull, and yet totally doting on their master. So ferocious to outsiders, but friendly to the ruling class. So, but if you were one of these heroic warriors, then you could have the pick of anyone you wanted to have sexual relations with, male or female. In Laws, he backed off of that, and he said the only acceptable form of sex is for the purpose of procreation. That young men and women should wait until they were 30 to 40 because that's the ideal age to have children, and then they should get married and have children, and anything outside that was forbidden. But he said Yeah, except that people are going to have affairs. That's just the way it is. Therefore, we'll have a second law that if they have an affair, they have to keep it quiet because it's bad for public morale for people to be taking each other's wives. And the other thing was homosexuality. That's you can't control that. That's an urge that you just can't control. So we have a second law there. If you're going to be gay, stay in the closet because it's bad for public morale. Don't ask, don't tell, or stay in the closet. So, and of course, Plato was, of course, homosexual. That's just, he didn't have any children, and it's just a matter of secondary historical sources say he was. That's not controversial or derogatory or anything. It's just a fact. So was Aristotle, and a lot of people back then were, and that's fine. But he really legislated all that hypocrisy, and the part about outlawing homosexuality that probably made it into the book of Leviticus in a very strong way. And that's not necessarily a great thing, because everybody should have a right to life and liberty and the pursuit of whatever happiness they can have.
There was also a whole lot of laws about adultery, and I mean, the death sentence for that sort of thing. I mean, it was for homosexuality or adultery. I mean, you died.
Well, I mean, there was just something anti-liberty about everything that Plato did, and what ended up being done with what Plato did. I think it was sort of conspicuous that Leviticus and the Jewish law comes out far harder on sexual immorality than even Plato does. It was sort of a little bit ironic, because he seems to at least have been far more realistic about it, but the seeds were always there for repression. The seeds, once you open the door for that anti-liberty stuff, it really just can go any way and can become quite crippling to a culture and very oppressive, and lots of people are getting stoned and dead and living in fear. And, it's not even a matter of staying in the closet. It becomes sort of like, it's an existential threat all of a sudden to certain types of people, which I think is very negative on a culture, to have existential threats in the legal system against people just basically doing kind of people things. I think that is a slippery slope that unfortunately is one more of the negative aspects of the Republic and the laws and the Platonic thinking.
Yeah, I think he pretty much greased the water slide and gave people a good shovel. I don't even think it's he started out in a very bad place, I think. But you're right though. Leviticus took it even further. So your point is well taken.
Yeah.
Well, what I find interesting is, from my understanding, one of the better parts of the New Testament was that at least it gave slightly, very mildly, this kind of liberalizing of that. There was this sort of statement, I think it's from John chapter, I can't remember, where it was, let he who is without sin cast the first stone.
John 20:21.
Oh, yeah, something like that. Where that was sort of, and you see that kind of being quoted a lot now, especially in defense of, well, yeah, you can judge people's sexual immorality all you want, but if you're not without sin, why don't you just, kind of like back off? So there was like a lot of that with the New Testament, sort of undoing what was done before.
Well, that's true. And, switching over to the New Testament just briefly, Jesus, he never said a word about homosexuality. Certainly Paul did. But Jesus never did. And yet he had, at least 6 or 8 or 10 speeches where he railed against hypocrisy and people who prayed in public and liked to say how religious they were, and all of his criticisms were for religious people and people who were self-righteous and pompous, and that is what he was against more than anything. And so it's kind of ironic when people posture in public about these issues that were of lesser importance, apparently, to Jesus as written in the Gospels.
Well, yeah, I mean, as a defense of kind of Jesus and the New Testament, it did have a couple of interesting sort of, I guess you could say, almost anti-Platonic or anti-Republic kind of things, because here's a person who spends most of his time basically using, clever tricks and whatever clever speech and ideas and wit to basically go against what were ostensibly the sort of the philosopher kings, the kind of like the theocratic class ruling over Judea. I mean, everything is about him sort of coming up with pithy ways to outfox and outlogic the religious authorities at the time. So there was something very anti-Platonic about it.
That's true. And Plato also, I think there's some arguments against Plato in Paul, rather, because he talks about how the law isn't that important, and forgiveness of sin and this and that, when Plato was very much that righteousness, obedience, that was the thing. You got everyone to obey the law, and prayers and sacrifices by the wicked so that their sins would be forgiven. To him, that was kind of blasphemous, because
Right.
that is letting the gods participate in human wickedness, basically.
Right.
The theology of the New Testament is it contains echoes of Plato, and mostly on the other side, I think.
Yeah.
Can we go back to your first book? I just want to kind of get back to that one, because you were talking about the kind of people who got together to do this job, to write this text, to gather, and I expect it took years to gather everything together. But the initial, writing of the Torah was probably the first step, and then began to gather the literature together, the remainder of it. So that probably took years. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that's exactly correct. The Torah, the books of Moses, they appear to have all been written at Alexandria around 270 BC. That was the first phase. And Plato, he had two phases. The first one was to come up with the Constitution and laws, and that's just what they did at Alexandria. And then his second phase was to come up with this national literature in support of the laws. And from all the hints that I can see in Plato's laws, I think that was supposed to take probably 10 years, because he said that there's going to be a 10-year period of adjustment. If some of the laws aren't quite perfect, then you can test them out and change them. And this was, there was the 10-year phase to get things all fixed was a big deal in Plato's laws. I think that's probably fairly accurate for when the first version of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament came together. And that took place in Jerusalem. That was no longer in Alexandria. They came home from Alexandria, and the people in Jerusalem seem to have taken charge of this phase. At Alexandria, you had Jews and Samaritans both working on the Torah, which is a sacred book to both the Jews and the Samaritans. The rest of the Bible, the Samaritans kicked to the curb, and the rest of the Bible, especially starting in the Book of Kings, has a very negative take on the Samaritans. It says that the the northern kingdom, they worship Baal, and they never came. Unlike the Jews, they never came back from exile, and basically the Samaritans were written out of the rest of the Bible. It's got a very exclusive focus on Jerusalem, even though there was a temple of Yahweh at Mount Gerizim that was larger than Jerusalem's temple and going on at the same time. So you're right. It took a few years. It probably took 10 years, and then it would have taken at least another generation for this new literature to be taught in the schools and the new institution called the synagogue and in the homes and all of that, and to indoctrinate the new youth coming up. Plato said it would take a generation, maybe 2 generations, and then the people wouldn't even remember their past. They would remember the new past that had basically been invented for them. And in our historical reading, that's basically what happened. So if you have around 270 BC, you have a theocracy, a new form of government in Judea. You have new laws, new literature. By around 200 BC, the historical sources said that the Jews said the Torah was there, it contained their ancient ancestral laws and constitution, that was their national text. And by the 160s BC, when the Seleucids tried to outlaw the Jewish religion and laws and literature, the Maccabees, they fought this war of liberation, a very brave war against huge numbers of invaders in order to save this literature. They didn't want a Greek constitution. They wanted their national ancestral laws back in place. So it really just in pretty much the time frame that Plato specified, the Jews fully adopted this new literature and laws and their Bible. And it's just like he wrote the history of the Jews.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's quite amazing. And but another aspect of his plan was that when you created this literature and these new laws and stuff for this new nation, the people had to believe that it was all of this was done in ancient times. Like the Jews had to believe that all of this was laid down by the laws of Moses for their ancestors. So as part of that process, that first generation of lawgivers, you almost have to erase the memory of those actual historical people who created this new set of laws and who established Plato's laws in this new country. And that kind of took place too because the Jewish scholars and Samaritan scholars who went to Alexandria and who created the books of Moses and wrote the laws of Moses and all of that, later generations didn't remember them as the authors of the books of Moses. They kind of demoted them to just translators. They took what was presented as ancient Hebrew writings, and all they did was translated them into Greek, and they were celebrated as just as important as the 70 elders at Mount Sinai who received the law in ancient times. But so these 70 people who wrote the books of Moses and the Pentateuch and started off this whole thing, they were kind of erased from memory. It's very interesting.
Any idea who any of them might have been?
Well, yes, I do possibly know one of them.
Yes.
But that's going to be in a future book.
Oh, please.
No, he can't give away all of his secrets.
No. I will give you a little preview here. Um, um, I had mentioned that both Jews and Samaritans wrote the books of Moses in Alexandria.
All right.
We know that because the books of Moses have all sorts of positive references to Gerizim, where the Samaritan temple was, and other important Samaritan places. And they doesn't really mention Jerusalem or they're Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. That was the thing. So, so there is a Samaritan author. His name hasn't actually come down to us, but scholars call him Pseudo-Eupolemus. Eusebius wrote a couple fragments of this Samaritan's writings, and it's very interesting stuff. And Eusebius mistakenly identified him as Eupolemus, who was a different Jewish author. So scholars say it wasn't really Eupolemus, but he was a Samaritan. He wrote these a couple passages preserved by the church father Eusebius, and this stuff that he wrote looks to be earlier than the Bible, and it does have some traditions about Abraham. For instance, Abraham went to Egypt and he brought the writings of Enoch with him and taught the Egyptians about astronomy. And it has all sorts of different esoteric things, like Abraham was descended from the giants, and different really fascinating stuff, and a lot of Hellenistic research and sources that were found at the Great Library of Alexandria. Looks to be pre-biblical, but researched at the Great Library, and I think he was one of the people who was there. I think that he was one of those 70 elders of the legend from Samaria and Judea. So yeah, and so in a future book, I'm gonna lay out some passages from the pseudepigrapha, which is kind of between the Jewish Bible and the New Testament. It preserves some of this stuff that's earlier than the Book of Genesis, that the Book of Genesis drew on, and it'll be really fascinating. I've got a great case to make. So that'll be a couple books down the line, though.
Do the books of Enoch figure into that?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I go ahead. I heard both of you at once, and so I heard.
Go ahead, Harrison.
How do the books of Enoch fit into that? Is that some of the stuff that you're talking about? Because there's that whole field of study that I think what's his name, Boccaccini, has devoted to the Enochic Judaism. Are you familiar with his work and how those texts might fit into this?
I am familiar with his work, and he has a whole elaborate theory of how Enochic Judaism was kind of different from and parallel to what he called Mosaic Judaism. Mm-hmm. The problem is with him and the people in his school of thought is that they accept this old chronology of biblical texts going back into, Persian era and earlier. So their chronology is all, you just have to toss. You just have to toss. But, and yet, there does seem to be a relationship between some of the Enoch traditions and the biblical text. You have, the figure of Enoch, and he was the seventh generation after Adam, and he walked with God, and he never died. That
like the Babylonian king.
Like the Babylonian king Enmerdaranki, the seventh king, and also one of the seventh Apkallu, or primordial sage in Babylonian myth. He also went to heaven, and they had heavenly wisdom there. And the whole Watcher myth, where the Watchers came down from heaven and they had all this angelic heavenly secrets of scientific lore, and they intermarried with the daughters of men and had giants. That's another, just a hint of a tradition in the Bible that suggests that there was a much larger tradition out there, and that was the only part that basically escaped the censors. And so 2 books from now, I'm going to be dealing with all of that and develop what the original Enochian traditions were and how they're related to the Babylonian traditions, like you mentioned, Enmer-Doranki and the 10 generations before the flood, and Mesopotamian scientific literature on astronomy and this and that, which came down to, in the books of Enoch, they're called Watcher lore, or the books of the Watchers. Well, this is scientific literature from Assyria and Babylonia, which persisted down into Jewish times, and which the authors of the Book of Enoch, they responded to very negatively. And yet some of that stuff was used in the Bible. The astronomical Book of Enoch was used in the first chapter of Genesis in its section on astronomy. The technical terminology there is exactly the same, and there's been James Vanderkam has written showing that, there's interdependence between the two. He thinks that the Bible is older, of course, and that the astronomical Book of Enoch came from that. He's got that backwards. But so there's a text that's older than the Bible that the Bible uses. And I think it's just fascinating finding these pre-biblical and proto-biblical traditions.
Well, there's a lot of flavor of Zoroastrianism in the Book of the Watchers, and also in and it's really, I had to really dig into the Zoroastrian thing because I had ignored it completely for such a long time. But just recently, Philip Davis, in one of his recent books, he proposed that upon the return from Babylon during the time of the Persians, that the religion that was propagated by the Persians, not necessarily by any big horde of returnees, was a form of Zoroastrianism. And I thought that was kind of interesting.
I think it's fascinating. I think there's something there. I have not... And, I've read Mary Boise, who's a big authority on ancient Zoroastrianism, and some other authors. And I think there's something there. I can't quite come up with a smoking gun as to when and where the influence came in, but definitely there's something. And the Zoroastrian dualism comes into the Qumran literature of the Sons of Light versus the Sons of Darkness, and that cosmic conflict has definite strains from Zoroaster. So somehow the influences made it in, and that's on my radar to research more at some future date. But it's fascinating finding the authentic old influences that are there.
Yeah. What are you working on right now?
Well, I'm working on 2 books. I'm working on 3 books. I've got at least 8 books lined up. It'll keep me busy for the rest of my. But the next 2 are, the first one is on Plato and the biblical creation account, Greek monotheism and Jewish polytheism in the primeval history. That's the title of my next one. And it will show how Genesis 1 came from Greek scientific cosmology, and in particular from Plato's Timaeus. And also Genesis 2 through 11, a lot of these myths and stories and stuff, which are so non-scientific, they were also foreshadowed by Plato. So anyway, it'll be a really interesting subject. And it will show how the ruling class monotheism in Genesis 1 coexisted with these crazy stories of God walking around in the Garden of Eden, or having lunch with Abraham, or things like that. And then my next book is going to be on this Enoch stuff, the Babylonian and Assyrian scientific traditions that kind of infiltrated the primeval history, and how the Samaritans were the channel of transmission for these Watcher traditions and Babylonian science and astronomy and things like that, how they were the means by which a lot of this stuff came to the later Jews and into the Bible. So those are the next two projects, and then I've got others after that, and a popular version of my Plato book.
Right. And is there any, do you have any timeline on when any of those three books are going to be released?
Well, the first two that I mentioned, I'm just swatting footnotes now. They're basically written, and I'm, getting all my references in place. And then there'll be a little revision. So they're going to be finished in very early 2017. And hopefully my popular book as well. I just need to sit down and get into a creative space and get my writing juices flowing for a more popular creative approach. It's going to be such a delight not to have to put a footnote after every sentence and to and to explain just how dramatic and fascinating this stuff is. The public needs to understand all of this stuff. It's kind of like for millennia we believed that that God created the universe in 7 days or whatever. And now we have telescopes that can see clear to the Big Bang and see the origins of the universe and study it. Really, we've got that old light from basically the moment of creation, and as scientists, we can look at it and figure out what was going on. Well, it's kind of the same way now with our more recent history and the origins of the Bible and Christianity and things like that. I think, or I hope, my books kind of are like a telescope into the past, where we see what was really going on, and we can see the cast of characters and what books they were reading, and what ideas were going through their minds when they were writing this stuff, and what their aims were. And I think it would be fascinating if everyone understood the story of how it all happened.
I agree.
I think it's very exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Harrison, give the names of his books again so that all the readers or listeners can make a note of them, and a website address.
Yep. So for all our listeners right now, we've got the hyperlinks in the show description. The two books are Berossus and Genesis, Manetho and Exodus from 2006, and 2016's Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible. They're both available on Amazon. The one unfortunate thing is that they're academic texts and very expensive as a result. But I do think that if any listeners are interested, they are worth it. These are I think some of the best books ever written on the topic from, my relatively limited
I agree.
Exposure to this kind of thing. But check them out. And if for whatever reason you can't afford it, try to get them in from your library. Try to, just do anything you can to try to find them. And I guess other than that, we'll just be waiting on your new books, Russell. And I'm looking forward to them.
If I may just toss in one final note, Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible is also available less expensively in a Kindle version for like $40-some. So some people have read that.
Oh, that's great.
And if you want to see my picture and my biography and all my books and stuff, you can go to russellgmirkin.com, which is a link that's also on that you kindly put up on your radio network page. And you can even send me an email if you want to visit. So
great.
But it's been very fun talking with you guys.
And
same here.
It's been a lot of fun.
It's been very educational for me. I thank you.
Well, when your next book comes out, we'll have to do it again so we can talk about that one.
Yeah.
I'd love to.
Well, great. Well, thanks so much,
I'm excited
Russell.
about the prospect of a popular book. I'm excited about that because as much as I actually enjoyed Plato and the creation of the Hebrew Bible, there was a point at which, following the footnotes, because then you go into the footnotes and then there's actually notes in the notes. It kind of got very sort of.
I read footnotes. What are you talking about?
Well, after a while, you're just like, okay, I agree that you've done the research. From now on, just you don't have to put any more footnotes for me. I see that you've been thorough. I trust you now. Let's just moving on the ideas because I feel compelled to read the footnotes.
But there are some gems in those footnotes.
There's some really great things in those footnotes, especially in the last chapter.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree. It's terrific.
All right.
All right, then.
Thanks again, Russell. It was great talking to you.
You're going to take us out, Harrison?
All right.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
So thanks again, and we'll talk to you all next week. Everyone take care.